Good.
Hey, Steve.
Hey,
Steve here.
oh my gosh, how you doing?
Good.
Good to see you.
Unemployed at the moment, but that's not too bad.
I think you're liking that though, right?
Yeah, that's all right.
Yeah. Well, sorry about your bash getting postponed. You know, your celebration.
Well, it may be postponed 2 years. Really, I'm not sure it's going to happen. We were going to postpone it 1 year to May, and I think it'd be safer to do it to postpone it 2 years.
Yeah, it's a crazy world, right?
Yeah, I'm not counting on the vaccine being publicly distributed by May.
Oh, come on, it's guaranteed to be out by election day, right?
Yeah, before election day.
Okay. As we all know, immediately after the election day, David Master will give a talk. And also he will talk about the Amazon and the Mekong and all the kind of large river and carbon stuff. So mark your calendar, guys. And so, okay, let's see. Okay, now clock. Hello, everybody. Welcome you again to this World Large River and Delta System Source to Sink webinar series. Today, we invite Professor Steve Kuehl from Virginia Institute of Marine Science to give a talk. It's kind of overview, review about the sediment, carbon delivery, and preservation of the Amazon, Ganges, Brahmaputra, and Erawadi and Solvent River. So as we all know, Steve, get his master and PhD from a very, very famous university. So North Carolina State University. So Steve, thank you. Be a member of the Wolfpack, Wolfpack, go Wolfpack. So Steve, Professor Vince, he has studied many world large river system, and as the title indicates. So before I give the floor to Steve, I would like to introduce this coming Friday. We have other talk about the global Delta data set. That's, I think, is a very interesting talk. So Rebecca graduated from Indiana State University, working with Doug Edmond. So that's I think will be very interesting. Based on their study, it will show the environmental variables that could predict the delta formation on the coast. As you can see, all that kind of data. I'm very look forward to her talk. So I think, Steve, so I give to you, please share. One more thing. And next week, we have 2 more talks, and Professor Liu Yu from Xi'an, he will talk about 500 year, a little bit longer scale about the Yellow River Basin change, the run of the sediment load, the change. And also Luca from University of Leeds, UK, he will talk about, interestingly, geological significance and source to sink controls on the delta parasequences, the kind of sequence stratigraphy, the cladform. So please mark your calendar again. So Steve, now you can share your screen.
Okay, everybody see and hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. Thanks very much, Paul, for the introduction. And good morning, good afternoon, and for my Chinese colleagues, Wang Hao. It's great to have you all here, and I'm really pleased to be part of this series. When Paul asked me to do this talk, it was early on in the scheduling, and so it wasn't fully fleshed out. And he said, well, you can look at the 3 rivers that you've studied in the past. And so I had a fairly ambitious plan. But then when I saw the schedule developed, essentially we have all the world's experts in all these deltas And so I've sort of trimmed down my focus a little bit and have a new title as shown here. But so I will still be exploring what's happening at the mouths of these three major systems: the Erawadi, Thanlwin, Ganges, Brahmaputra, and Amazon. And the talk will focus mainly because of all the great talks. Steve Goodbread's going to be speaking about the Ganges, and Chuck Nitrower in January, and people like Dave DeMaster and Bob Aller and Tom Bianchi. So all these folks will be able to, I think the sum total of these talks will be just a fantastic legacy for this series, Paul. So thank you very much. Okay, I want to just start by providing a little bit of justification for the focus of this presentation, and take a little bit of a step back. So I'm sure most of you recognize that continental margins are often thought about as containing very high resolution record of Earth history, in part because of the high inputs from rivers and the resulting high sedimentation rates. They're also places of massive carbon burial and geochemical cycling. And if you look at the architecture of continental margins, and this is from a paper about back in 2015 by Petruno and others, and on a continental margin scale, well, actually on several scales. So you can look at the development of the entire continental margin as occurring in different time and spatial scales. So from the shoreline to the shelf cliniform to the entire margin. And so on the right in panel B is sort of the area showing the area that I'm going to be focusing on for today's talk. And these are the cliniforms, mainly the offshore part, maybe a little bit about the onshore part. So this is the subaerial and subaqueous delta. We've talked a lot about subaerial delta and a lot about sort of human effects on the delta. And so now we're going to move offshore a little bit and look at what's happening out there. And I'm going to make the case that in some instances, the offshore cliniform makes up the majority of the modern delta depot center. And I think in the end, we're going to need to sort of think about, as we move forward in time with all the various human effects on the landscape and damming of rivers, what is the relationship between the offshore depot center and what's happening onshore? So I kind of went back and was thinking about, for these three different systems, what are some of the main characteristics? And a lot of the data here is taken from the land to sea database, as shown here, in terms of basin area, water discharge, and some of the sediment numbers. I've picked some other numbers from the literature and scoured for inputs of organic carbon. So I'll fill in those references when I hand in my slides later. But as you can see, for these three systems, these are, arguably today, in terms of sediment discharge, these are the three largest inputs at the current time. And I'll talk more about that in a minute. But there are some pretty big differences. Of course, the Amazon is the largest by far in terms of the drainage basin. And I should mention that for the GB Meghna, it's the Ganges Brahmaputra Meghna. So if you just want to look at the bold numbers, that's the sum of the three river inputs that make up this large system. And the AT Sitang is the Erawadi, Thanlwin, and Sitang River, which again, the bold numbers here are the sum of the individual river basins that make up together, combined to make those delta systems. So Amazon has the largest basin, and one thing that's really a standout, in addition to the basin size, is the water input. So wet tropical something approaching 20% of the world's river water input is happening at the mouth of the Amazon to the oceans. And it also has a very large sediment discharge. Now this number of 1,200 or over a billion tons per year is, I think that's a Milliman and Mead number, and there's some discussion about that, but so it may be the first or second largest in terms of sediment discharge, but it doesn't really matter. Within error, probably the Ganges and the Amazon are similar in terms of their inputs. So the Erawadi is a little bit smaller, about half the drainage basin size of the Ganges, similar, about halved water inputs, but contains quite a bit of sediment, so about 500 million tons per year, and a pretty large carbon input. This is from a recent paper by Bird. And so depending on which number you believe, it's either the second or third largest input of organic carbon. Of course, the Amazon being wet tropical and having so much water input is the largest in the world. So in terms of some more comparisons between these three areas, in terms of the offshore setting, looking at tides, waves, winds, and currents, you can see that all of these numbers for the tides are pretty high. So they go into the macrotidal range. The Ganges is maybe a little bit lower on the western side, but it peaks at 6 and locally in some of the channels. The Erawadi is almost off the scale. It's extremely high range, and we'll see some more about that later. Waves for the Amazon, because it's dominated by the trades, they're fairly consistent throughout the year. And also, of course, in this area, we don't have tropical cyclones, so that's really not an issue for this river that discharges right at the equator. The Ganges and the Erawadi have similar, and these are at the high end of the significant wave height for the windy season. But these 4+ numbers reflect the influence of tropical cyclones in these areas. So again, Amazon trade wind dominated, both the Ganges and Erawadi are monsoon influenced, and so they have currents that seasonally reverse. The currents off the Amazon are driven by the North Brazil current, and that's a very energetic current. And as we saw from Edward Anthony's talk, it helps, along with the wave action, to drive the Amazon mud deposition all the way up to the Orinoco Delta. Different marginal settings here. So Amazon is a passive margin, Ganges is foreland basin, peripheral, the area we'll be talking about. And then the Erawadi, interestingly, is really right in an active margin, just depositing into the active margin, probably the only major system in the world that does so. Shelf width, Amazon and Ganges are both quite wide. The Erawadi is variable. So I'm going to start off talking about the Erawadi, and then move toward the end. I'll show just a few slides on the Ganges and on the Amazon because of the other upcoming talks that are going to be covering these in great detail. So again, most of my presentation will be on the Erawadi. And as you can see, both the Erawadi as well as the Ganges Brahmaputra originate from the Tibetan Plateau, the water tower of Asia. And these numbers in the arrows represent the current in black, and then the historical in red sediment discharge. And so, as we've talked about and heard about from several previous talks, because of human modifications, mainly large dams, the river supply in these areas are heavily reduced. And the exception really, well, the Ganges has some damming, of course. So this number may not be good, but it's close to, still close to 1 billion tons. The Irrawaddy Delta is a recent paper in Nature that's suggested that it's probably the last free-flowing system in Asia, so outside of the Arctic. This is, may provide some motivation for focusing effort here, because that's probably not going to be the case moving forward. So let's set up for the Erawadi. This is the sort of the basic setting. You've got subduction of the Indian plate and formation of the Indo-Burman range. So this is the Erawadi Delta down in this area. And a major feature that we'll come back to is this transform fault, the Saginaw fault, which essentially bisects the Erawadi Delta and opens into a back arc basin with the trench on the western side. So, and then you can see on the right panel historical earthquake and movement along the major faults in this this tectonically active margin. So focusing now on the Erawadi drainage basin. So you can see again, this system I've been referring to it as the Erawadi, but it's actually 3 river systems in one. The Erawadi drainage basin is outlined in this aqua color. And you can see that here's the geopolitical boundary of Myanmar. So it's mostly in Myanmar. It goes a little bit into India and touches in China. And I have to back up. There we go. The basin outlined in yellow is the Than Lawin, or otherwise known as Salween. And you can see that this stretches up onto the Tibetan Plateau and comes out to the eastern side of the bay here. And then in between this green and yellow line down here is a smaller system, but still an input of sediment and water. This is the Sitang Basin. So these 3 rivers together contribute close to 500 million tons to the northern Andaman Sea. So this is a nice figure that Paul put together in part based on data from Liviu Gosian's work in 2018, and shows the growth of the Erawadi Delta in the Holocene. And so you can see this wedge here that's prograded out between the Indo-Burman and the Bago-Yoma range. And one thing I want to point out is that you can see from these dashed lines are the old shorelines. And it appears that the growth towards the coast has decelerated in the past few thousand years. And there have been, Headley's reported based on nautical charts that the mouths of the Erawadi, which are in the western side, basically are either not prograding or erosional at the present time. So grew out very quickly in the middle to early Holocene, middle part to late Holocene, but now it's slowed down considerably. So I'll be talking about some work from a recent field study there, which happened in 2017. And before that, there was actually very little work done offshore here. So this is really the only comprehensive, there was bits and pieces earlier, but the only comprehensive expedition was an Indian cruise to the area that essentially did water column and a bunch of grab samples in the entire area. And so they produced the map that's shown here on the left, and this is just the surface grain size distribution on the right. And some of the features that you can pick up just from the chart is the morphology of the western or the eastern and western delta is quite different, and that's roughly the boundary of this fault zone. So on the eastern shelf, you've got a flat and what looks clearly to be a cliniform-like feature here, and then this relatively deep shelf depression, the Martaban depression, which leads out to the Submarine Canyon. And then on the west side, the Erawadi is more like a ramp. So both shelves here, east and west of the fault, are fairly wide, but then it wraps around, and on the far west in the north, the shelf is quite narrow, and that's where you're essentially just onshore of the trench. So grain size shows, as you would expect, a mud patch, and this is a fairly large area. So for reference, this bay here, or the Gulf of Martaban, is about 25,000 square kilometers. So it's pretty large, and the mud extends offshore that towards that Martaban depression. The rest of the shelf to the south in the northern Andaman Sea is sort of a patchwork. It looks like relic to palimpsest material, maybe a little fine stuff off the mouths of the Irrawaddy, and then another mud patch in the Bay of Bengal. And so that's really all we had going into this study. And one thing I want to emphasize is that Gulf of Martaban, so this is from the International Space Station, and you can see a rough scale across so we're looking south. These are the mouths of the Erawadi here. You can see this is the major Erawadi Delta. Here's the Sitang coming in the middle. It's a relatively small system, but still it's at the head of the bay, discharging about 50 million tons a year. And then the Thanlewin's quite different. You can see it drops out of the mountains, and there's really not much of a delta plain, but it contributes, quite a bit, close to 200 megatons of sediment. So it's a big input, but not much of a subaerial expression. But all three rivers, the Erawadi, Sitang, and Thanlewin, combine in this, what I'll refer to later as a mixing chamber, and you'll see why. So the other influence on this coast is of course, an occasional cyclone. This was a really devastating one, Cyclone Nargis, back in 2008, which tracked across the front of the delta. And you can see kind of the before and just after the storm, how much flooding, destruction, and unfortunately loss of life occurred for this major storm. So this is you don't have as frequent cyclone activity here as compared to the Ganges, but occasionally you do have, obviously, you have some influence. So we were lucky enough to provide, get a little money from NSF to look at this area, and this shows some of our activities. I think this is a slide from Paul Liu. So the study was funded by NSF. Courtney Harris is my co-PI at VIMS, and Paul Liu was the collaborating PI at North Carolina State. And so we spent a couple weeks in December of 2017 collecting chirp data, water column data, and sediment cores. And we were lucky to have reasonably good conditions and very nice haul of data. So this just shows the areas that we sampled. Again, mouths of the Erawadi, Sitang River, Thanlewin. This is the Gulf of Martaban. So we covered a fairly broad area. The black lines here are the chirp profiles. The red dots are the sampling locations. We also had some samples in the river. And I'm just going to jump right to showing some of the chirp data, and one of the major results, I think, that's important for this discussion, which is as expected in this energetic environment with very large sediment inputs, a lot of the sediment is moved offshore into the deeper parts of the shelf. And in this case, it's forming a thick, very nicely stratified cliniform within that Martaban depression. So essentially you've got a bowl out here, and it's just filling up like gangbusters boy, I'd like to have a long core from this area because it's gonna it'll be have a nice record for the past 7,000 years or so. You can see that the cliniform comes out to about here, and then you start to see these blocky features, and so that's probably an incipient pull apart basin. So you have old blocks of material which are being rotated and tilted, and so you can see the influence of tectonics and in particular that transform fault which cuts through the area. I should mention we have measured sedimentation rates on the cliniform, and they're typical high rates that you would expect on the four sets of about 10 centimeters per year, and they decreasing offshore and as you'll see in a minute, also decreasing landward. We did get out to the edge of the shelf in this area here to survey the canyon because previous studies had suggested off-shelf escape. And we didn't see any evidence in the canyons. It's swept pretty clean, a pretty hard reflector, and there's also doesn't appear to be any connectivity between the modern shelf cliniform and the canyon head. So based on that, we don't think there's very much getting out there. There might be a little bit in sort of a nepheloid-like layer, but other than that, it looks to be separated from the canyon at the present time. So moving around, so we're coming around to the northwestern part of the shelf over here. So this is the narrow shelf area that wraps around. And again, we can see well stratified muds, but this is not, it's not a prograding cliniform. So this is kind of the shelf break here. So it looks to be more of a mud drape type feature. So it's kind of suggesting more kind of dispersive transport in this part, moderate to low sediment accumulation rates, but, clearly a nice mud deposit overlying sort of a transgressive surface. One question here that we still are trying to address is the source of sediment for this area, and we're hoping that combination of geochemical tools and modeling will help us address whether this area is receiving sediment supply from the Erawadi or maybe local rivers along the Indo-Burman range. So lots of questions still. Interestingly, when we get to the mouths of the Erawadi, and so this is the major input for this area, we don't see a thick mud deposit. This is a pretty hard surface reflector, and down here is a multiple, of course, and then maybe some shallow penetration. It looks a little bit chaotic, and so and the sedimentation rates are quite low. So I think that reflects the fact that you're not getting much staying off the mouths of the major system. It's going somewhere else, and it may also be related to the fact that the Erawadi inputs are a little bit coarser grained, but I think it's probably the former. So Paul put together a wonderful Isopack map in his 2020 paper based on the Chirp data. So looking at, I'm sorry, the image got a little shifted, but this is the Isopack, just move it over a little bit to the left. Based on the volume that he calculated, assuming some reasonable densities and integrating over the past 7,000 years, that sediment volume equates to an input of about 250 megatons per year. So, maybe a little less than half of what the modern system is thought to be putting in. And of course, some of that is obviously going to be explained by the fact that we're not accounting for the delta plane material that's deposited subaerially. But interestingly, we've also looked at recent sedimentation rates from lead 210, and I think just jumping ahead, we've done a very preliminary budget for this area. It still needs some work. There's a student at VIMS working with me on this, Evan and Flynn, and she is trying to finalize this. But the very first look at integrating the lead-210 rates across the shelf, you can see it. The locus of deposition is similar to the Chirp data, but when we look at the areas, it appears that we can account for much of the discharge that's coming out of the river today. So that suggests two things, two possibilities. One is that the deposition perhaps has shifted entirely offshore as moving toward the present, or our estimate of the river discharge is dead wrong. So we'll see. Evan is working on finalizing that budget, and hopefully you might be able to see it during the AGU this fall. So I'd like to shift now to some of the water column observations and work that has done as part of this study by Courtney Harris and her staff and students. This is CTD data, basically from offshore the Delta, and as expected, if you look at CTD, so temperature, salinity, also there's an OBS and then density. If you look offshore in sort of mid-shelf depths, you see normally stratified water column with higher density at depth. But, and this is kind of a sidebar, but I think it's really interesting. In the shallow shelf areas, and also in many cases in the river mouth area, it appears that salinity decreases toward the bottom, and also density, which is exactly the opposite of what you would expect. And it turns out that Held in 2014 sort of talked about artifacts that result from very, very high fluid mud suspensions. And so our conclusion is that, this is not reality. We're not really seeing inverted density profiles in the water column. But what we're seeing is, the satellite photo showed us high surface turbidity, but we're also seeing probably massive fluid muds in this area in the mid-shelf in the Gulf of Martaban. So Courtney Harris and Matt Fair, who's a graduate student at VIMS, working on in the modeling program, they've been very active in developing a ROMS model for this area, and you can see the various input of waves, atmospheric forcing, tides, and so forth. And so I've got a little bit of data that I can show you, that some of it's actually pretty recent and relates to this discussion. So this is first from the SWAN data. We can look at sort of the influence of waves, wave height. And so just a video which the arrows will show the wind direction, and then the colors represent the wave height, with the yellows being stronger. And so you can see, and this is in August, and the thing to pick up is that most of the wave action, when the waves are strong, is focused on the in this area here, right now. And then the Gulf on the other side is fairly protected from waves. And so this may be one reason why we're not seeing progradation of the mouths of the Irrawaddy at the present time. So it's going out during the Holocene, it's sort of anchored by the Indo-Burman range, which then dips below the surface here. But once it's reached this position, it looks like it's kind of in an equilibrium. And of course, we can argue if sand mining might be another contributing factor here, but certainly I think we need to consider the wave action. This is actually a very recent result from the ensemble model that Matt Fair has put together. And you can see sort of the influence of tides moving. I mentioned earlier the high tide range, but here you can see this is the spring tide range moving from west to east, and just phenomenally high tides as you move toward the eastern part of the study area. And that's motivating this high resuspension and probably the formation of fluid muds in the Gulf here. This little low spot here in the north, Matt was telling me is maybe an artifact of the model, but in the general trend of increasing tides seems to be pretty solid. And so if you look at bed stress from waves and currents, I think it tells a nice story. So this is bed stress in August and January, and from waves, and then over on the right is bed stress from currents. So you can see for the waves, a lot of the action is concentrated again during the southwest monsoon, is concentrated at the mouths of the Irrawaddy. But I mean, look at the current bed stress, and this is the tidal current activity that we see focused in the Gulf of Moribund. And Matt was kind enough to share a sort of a preliminary production model run that he essentially generated this past Friday. And I think you can get this, you really get the sense of sort of the importance of the reversing tides in motivating sediment movement. So this is depth integrated concentration as the color gets denser, and the arrows represent the depth integrated currents. So I'm sure you'll be hearing a lot more of that in the future from Matt and from Courtney, and I just wanted to share that with you. Let's see if I can move on. Okay, I guess I got to go to the arrow. Okay, another take-home message from this area, I think, is so we've seen very high turbidity levels in the Gulf of Moribund, and we think we see, although again it's based on a few CTD samples, we think we see fluid muds in the lower part of the water column. The seabed expression of that is actually pretty striking. These are lead-210 profiles, which show, we've seen this in other areas like the Amazon. I'll show later on in the talk if there's time. But this uniform activity to depths, it can reach it for the Erawadi to a meter, meter and a half. And so this kind of indicates fairly frequent disturbance of the seabed. And we don't really, have a good sense of whether that's a spring neap thing or if it's related to seasonal monsoon reversal or what, but it does look like you have much reworking. And one of the interesting observations, and this is just some of the field data, but I think it's informative, showing the gray are the X-ray day graphs, and the on the right of each one is a photo. And so distributed throughout the study area. And if you look at the coloration of the cores in the photos, you have this reddish color in the Gulf of Moribund and in the eastern part where those tides are so strong, as opposed to more gray color elsewhere. And I think this is sort of a hint to us that this frequent seabed disturbance is causing maybe some diagenetic changes in mineral formation that's causing this reddish tinge. And again, this is just sort of based on observational data. We know from people like Bob Aller, and this is Tom Bianchi's paper on. We know these margins, as I said earlier, are centers of carbon burial. They're also centers of oxidation and geochemical exchange. So this process of very intense mixing of the seabed, and in the case of the Irrawaddy, the incredible gradients in bottom stress, currents, waves, and the potential, actually, what I haven't talked about is trapping within the Moribund Bay, you know, present a really interesting laboratory for studying these processes, which are globally significant. And this is also out of Paul Liu's paper, and it's only based on a handful of surface samples, but it shows from lignins and del C13, C to N, that, you know, if you move from the river mouth out into the Gulf, you're definitely seeing a change in the riverine organic carbon, decreasing vascular plant material, increasing oxidation. And so there's a lot going on here, and we're just now scratching the surface. So this is sort of where we are. This is an evolving model. I've showed this at some previous talks, and this is the next iteration, but I think it sort of summarizes the picture of what we think is going on for the Erawadi. It does appear that, you know, a lot of the material coming out of the major source in the west is moving into the Gulf of Martaban and combining with inputs from these other rivers to form a large area in the Gulf, which is intensively mixed. And then offshore, somehow, we don't know how, but it's getting out into the basin, whether that's storm driven or seasonal driven or tidal, you know, fortnightly. We don't really know. But and most likely, it's also combining with input from primary production offshore. You know, this area, along with the Ganges, offshore areas, are probably one of the most highly productive regions in the Indian Ocean area. And, you know, the production here is probably some of this is being drawn in through estuarine type circulation and combining. And so I think there's a really interesting story for the geochemistry. And, you know, we may have a situation similar to what we saw on the Amazon, where, you know, you've got this incineration and reflux in these shallow areas from mixing, and then burial offshore. But it sort of depends on what's the residence time here versus direct transport and accumulation. So we still have lots of questions. So I want to just bring that to a conclusion for the first part before I mention very briefly the Ganges and the Amazon. So we've got very strong gradients of forcing by waves and tides, and this is again causing that resuspension in the Gulf. Major cliniform, efficient trapping in the Martaban Depression in that deep bowl, and the potential for really nice high resolution record because it's so deep, and it looks to be beautifully stratified without very much disturbance by slumping or sliding. I mentioned about the carbon sequestration and potential for reoxidation, but we still have lots of questions. One interesting take home also that I think Paul's mentioned is the idea that, you know, we've got also to think about recycling of sediment and carbon over longer geologic timescales, especially along the west, where whatever is escaping is going directly into the trench. So in the remaining few minutes, I'm going to just mention a few points, Ganges and the Amazon. I'm looking forward to talks coming up that will, you know, really go into the top to bottom details of these systems. But for now, this is an old figure, but oldie but goodie from Steve Goodbread, which basically shows, and I'm going to focus down here, but you can see the mouths. Well, first of all, I guess I should mention, because it's so well illustrated, there's a lot of tectonic vertical motion in the delta plane, which forms these basins that trap significant parts of the Ganges and Brahmaputra inputs. And this is a foreland basin, so I mean you would expect that, but also in the very south, in the Delta Front region, you've got migration of this river system towards the east over time. So this is sort of the moribund part of the delta, the Sundarbans, moving into the kind of mixed tidal fluvial and then the active channel over here. So it has evolved over the Holocene. This is sort of the modern area, and then where you have sediment and water coming in from the river, and most of the growth and development over here in the moribund part is from tidal action and input from the shelf. So this is a figure from Rogers et al. Showing, and this is kind of one of the major points of this part of the talk, this area, unlike the Irrawaddy and unlike the Amazon, has a major submarine canyon system impinging very close to the shoreline. I had to go back to some early work that we did that shows sort of the cartoon of what was time with major inputs in the east and then transport along the shelf, this nice cliniform, but trapping and transport into the canyon. So this is a canyon, heavily canyon influenced system. The cliniform here shows some very interesting features. So this is from Michaels and other. So this is the profiles across the foreset and bottom set beds. But one thing you can notice here, see these transparent layers these are parasound profiles. These are essentially cyclone-driven liquefaction failures of the foresets. So this area is heavily influenced by cyclones, unlike the Irrawaddy, which may get occasional cyclone, and unlike the Amazon, which never gets a cyclone. You see lots of sediment remobilization by cyclones, and that remobilization, so this is a nice piece of work done by Rogers and Goodbread. They happened to have a survey before a major tropical cyclone sitter, and I don't have time to dwell on it, but the before and after photos this is across the canyon area, show clear evidence of mass failure related to the passage of this particular cyclone. So, and this just kind of summarizes this system, and I don't have time to dwell here, but again, most of the inputs are coming out to the shelf, forming this major subaqueous cliniform and being transported to the west in large part by cyclones and trapped. And so you have an active canyon system for this particular one. Here's the Moribund Delta over here, which is mainly in the tidal, influenced by tides. So very quickly, just jumping to the Amazon. This is the granddaddy of them all. And I want to point out this paper that actually it won't be published physically until 2021, but is still available now through this or shortly through this link. So this is a very nice summary that was put together by Chuck Nitrower and others. Really nice job looking at the top to bottom. So truly a source to sink analysis of the system. So check it out, and I'm sure Chuck will be talking about it. But again, look at this system, it's quite different. You've got most of the sediment coming in from the Andes, traveling through a long flat plain and entering the ocean at the equator, and then traveling all the way up to the north to the Orinoco Delta, forced by the North Brazil current and wave action. So, and I'm getting 2 slides from the end. This is just sort of a summary of what we see on the Amazon, of what we saw on the Amazon, I should say. So again, you have a subaqueous delta mud deposit, which is prograding out. One thing interesting, it's always fascinated me when I think about it, is because of the discharge of this river, fresh water extends out to the middle part of the shelf, and you never get salt water coming into the mouth. So the estuary for the Amazon is actually out on the continental shelf. Really fascinating system, and that's because of the huge volumes of water coming out. And also in these last two slides, I couldn't help myself from kind of looking back at some of our earlier work. So see, these are some deep tracks. This is some work done by Gail Kinnicky, and this is going across the middle part of the shelf, showing these very dense bottom flows. So we're kind of circling back to some of the features that we saw in the Irrawaddy. These are fluid muds. And then in the salinity profiles, you can see this stratification, estuarine-like stratification on the open part of the shelf. So just really fascinating area. And so one of the consequences on the Amazon shelf is if you look at, these are profiles of lead-210 taken from the force sets of the delta, and we'd never seen anything like that before. So these are clearly non-steady state. So these are 250 centimeters of oscillating excess activity down the core. We had no idea what this represented. We couldn't even calculate sedimentation rates until we actually developed a new approach. And when we did, sedimentation rates are high, but the point is these fluctuations represent periodic inputs to the force sets by sediment gravity flows. And if you look at the frequency of these oscillations, they happen about once every 2 to 3 years. So I think there's still some interesting work to be done here to understand this, but very different situation from the Irrawaddy, where we saw relatively steady profiles. And so it appears that the mechanism for building this delta, at least based on the geochemistry, might be quite different. The other deep tracks thing last thing I'll mention is, and this is again a parallel to the Irrawaddy. So this is from the Amazon open shelf, very deep. This is again this deep physical mixed layer. This one shows a vertical profile down to 150 centimeters. And since we started looking at that, there's been a lot of work done by folks like Bob Aller, and then this is this paper by Neil Blair. And so you've got this very energetic coastal environment. In this case, the muds are being mixed, and then they're moving out and moving up the coast, and that strongly influences the kind of the geochemical exchanges between the water column and the seabed, and also the preservation of carbon as you move along this shelf. So that's all I'll say about that. And then, just some closing thoughts. I'm not going to go into a long conclusion, but these are really first order observations. Large rivers entering energetic settings form big underwater deltas, and in the case of the Irrawaddy, the present day cliniform may be the majority of the discharge. We do see variations in the subaqueous delta from probably tide influence to cyclone influenced, so this relates in part to oceanographic processes, but also in part to kind of the geologic setting and tectonics. I think despite the fact that they all have a common shape as a cliniform, I think that it may be very different in terms of the carbon burial and cycling story. And so, the Amazon with that long stretch of cycling is probably maybe in the extreme. We don't really know about the Erawadi yet. And then finally, as the last kind of take home I'd like to throw out there, we really need to start thinking about linkages between these major underwater deposits and what's happening on land. I think as we move into the future and as we start to see increased influence on some of these relatively pristine systems with the addition of dams and the shutdown of the sediment supply, these deltas, subaqueous deltas, are going to degrade, and there's going to be some feedback between what's happening offshore and onshore, is my guess, as well as implications for things like ocean productivity and ecology. But I'll end there, and I'm happy to take any questions if there's time.
Thank you, Steve, for this fantastic talk. So very good overview review. So we have some questions already lined up. So we have questions from Wuri and Clark, Michael and Dave DeMaster and Jim Best. So the rest of them, if you have a question, please raise your hand. So raise the hand not physically, but virtually, click the participants, then raise the hand. Then we know, you line up for the question. Okay, Wuri Shatner from University of Haifa, Israel. Wuri, do you want to speak out your question?
Can you hear me now?
Yes, go ahead.
Okay. Hi. Thank you for the very interesting talk. For me, it's the first time to go to this place of the world, and very, very interesting.
Thank you.
While you were talking, I was looking at the paper, the very recent paper of Paul, and at the maps. And now I have one question and maybe one suggestion or comment. So the question is, can you say a few words about the currents and the directions, and maybe there's a shift or a change during the transgression, during the Holocene, because as I saw, all the clinoform was accumulated during the Holocene. And the other thing, so that's the ocean bottom currents. And the other thing is about the Chirp data itself. We used Chirp data, and instead of showing it in the regular envelope shape attribute, we used the phase, and suddenly we got a lot of the resolution was amazing. And when I saw the data that you show in the presentation and in the paper, I saw that sometime in 2/3 of the Holocene, I'm just guessing, there is a shift in the depositional pattern on the western side, on the southern side, and a little bit on the eastern side. So maybe there's a shift in the sediment influx, and maybe there's a shift in the ocean bottom currents. I don't know.
Yeah, I don't think those are great questions. I don't know that I have very good answers, particularly for currents earlier in the Holocene. We don't, Courtney Harris's group is modeling the present day shelf, and I think we'll have a very good sense of, what's driving, for example, east and west transport by the shifting monsoons. But earlier, I really don't know. In terms of the Chirp data and the Holocene evolution, one thing that occurred to me actually when it's kind of fun looking back at the Ganges and how it has mentioned that it has shifted toward the east, and perhaps the paleogeography of that system was similar to what we're seeing in the Erawadi today. So one has to wonder if you might see a continued eastern shift filling in that Gulf of Martaban. So that's just speculation.
Okay, Clark, go ahead.
Hey, Steve, good morning. That was a great talk. Thanks very much for that.
Thanks, Clark.
Looking at the modeling coming out of Courtney's group, it looked like there were these sort of jets of suspended sediment moving offshore. Do you think that's real? Is that a process that's feeding stuff? Yeah.
So when Matt sent me his production model run on Friday, he said, he's like, oh my God, we're seeing this major feature, and we're not like 100% sure it's real, but it may be suggestive of, some kind. To me, it looks like tidal pumping, where you're really just, that stuff is jetting out in that area of extremely high tides in the east. So I wouldn't be surprised if there's some, physical reality there. And one of the things we're really interested in, and is really not part of the model at this part, is what's driving the bottom transport and the potential for sediment gravity flows coming off the shallow area into the basin. And so that may be a hint that some of that is possible. So
Really exciting. Yeah, thanks.
Thanks, Clark.
Okay, next, Michael Stegler.
Okay. Well, it wasn't really a question, but it was a great talk. I really enjoyed it. But when you showed the on the Brahmaputra, those transparent zones, actually Luisa Palamengi and others have been interpreting those as actually earthquake-induced homogenization, not from cyclones.
Yes. Sorry for that omission. I didn't mention the importance of earthquakes. Yeah, my bad. I think cyclones are clearly important for transporting. I think they're clearly involved in some of the net transport westward along the shelf, and that's intercepted by the canyon. And it may well be that earthquakes are the more important or the most important driver of those failures. I wouldn't be surprised if some of them were cyclone generated. So I wouldn't rule it out. One of the things that's interesting, and I didn't get a chance to show it, but those layers are like fluidized flows. They're completely, not only are they structureless in terms of the acoustic signature, but if you actually look at the cores, you can see the microfabric. It's homogeneous. It's quite remarkable. So what to me, the point of that was, you're getting a sort of an interruption in sort of the Holocene record in that area because of these disturbances. And we're not seeing that, at least not yet, off the Irrawaddy.
Right, and that's particularly on the slope of those facets. And I agree, the cyclones are really important in driving the sediments, for instance, back onshore in
Right.
the western part. And in fact, for the swatch of no ground, it's really noticeable when I went to the Sundarbans in both the Indian and Bangladeshi side of how much more sediment starved you are when you reach the Indian part of the Sundarbans.
Yeah, and that onshore-offshore transport, or sort of the onshore transport, I think, especially in the Sundarbans area, that's where it makes me think about start to think about linkages between sort of the subaqueous deposit and, what happens when you cut off the supply, is that going to accelerate sort of the destruction of that area because you're not getting those inputs any longer. But
Right. I think a lot of the rivers in the southwest in Bangladesh have been decaying since the Ganges switched from the Hooghly Channel eastward in the 1600s.
right. Thanks, Mike.
Next is Dave DeMaster. Dave.
Thanks, David. Great talk. I enjoyed seeing all that material come together. My question is, you mentioned reoxidation by deep sediment mixing, and I presume that that's all physical by bottom currents. But I'm just wondering about if there's much bioturbation at all. And the reason I ask is because you're looking into organic carbon preservation. And we found in some of our labile organic carbon work that the benthic biological community is an important factor in controlling the preservation of organic carbon. So I'm wondering what the bioturbation intensity is like. Are there any animals, or it's accumulating so fast? Maybe it's not. Maybe there isn't a bioturbation expression.
Yeah, so we didn't look at the benthic biology, but we did take a series of X-ray radiographs, and just you do see bioturbation in the western part of the delta and along the northwestern coast, but in that very turbid zone with all the fluid muds, and I mean, I just don't know how anything can survive in there, and we don't see any evidence of bioturbation in the X-ray radiographs. So I think, at least in terms of the macrofauna, it's nil in the eastern part in that Gulf, and even into the foresets of the cliniform. We're not really seeing anything there.
Don Rhodes, a benthic biologist, always said that if on the order of 4, pretty much precludes much bioturbation. There are a few things burrowing shrimp and such that can live there, but usually not much else.
Yep. I think that's consistent with what we're seeing in the X-rays.
Yeah, thanks.
Thanks, Dave.
Next, James Best.
Hey, Steve, thanks so much. It's a fascinating talk. I learned a huge amount. It looks an amazing system. Hey, I fear you might give me a one-word answer to this one, but you mentioned the potential influence of sand mining on contemporary sediment flux.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm just wondering, is there any indication as to what the magnitude of that mining might be in either rivers or coasts compared to the amount of sediment coming down the rivers?
Well, I mean, I think compared to the total, this is just a guess, but I think compared to the total volume of sediment coming down, it may not be large, but there's been lots of recent work on the importance of sands, particularly in developing the delta front area. So maybe it's not so much the volume, but the fact that the caliber is such that it's a critical component of the subaerial delta construction. I don't know personally. So that's the arm waving answer. I don't know if we have good estimates of the volume. Maybe Edward Anthony or Paul could have a better idea.
I can give a quick reference. The official number from the Erawadi River alone is 20 million tons per year, the official one. But of course, we all know the illegal unofficial one could be double or triple this number. So I think safely estimate could be 40 or 50 million tons. This is from the Erawadi, the Yanguama part, not the Selwyn. So that could be a count, maybe, as you can see, 20% of the whole. We don't know because
What's the sand flux coming down the rivers then, Paul, per year?
Of course, this is another good question. Normally, they said estimate 200 to 300 total, but we don't know how much of the bedrock, how much of the sand friction. So, but the taking off the 20 or 40 million tons purely, mainly the sand. So, but of course, that's something very interesting. And I think Edgardo is just to have a manuscript you just submitted, right? So,
okay, thanks, Paul.
Yeah.
Thanks, Steve.
So next is Gil. Gil.
Steve, thanks.
Gail?
Just echo everybody's. It's like old home week, hearing a lot of this stuff and seeing everyone kind of coming together. So great talk. I guess the question actually changed about 3 times through the course of your talk, from any cyclic lead 210 signals to transport to the Moribund Basin. And then I guess I was kind of following on to what Clark asked about, with sort of the appearance of these jets with kind of the tidal pulsing.
Yeah.
Well, I guess my question is the timing of the sediment delivery, does that play a role, like during when the monsoon season starts and heavy rains, you get a big dump and then it's reworked and redistributed, in which case would something like thorium show you recent deposits, or do you think it's more of like a continuous and leaky mixing spring neap cycle maybe that can deliver it to where the slope is greatest for flow? And if you can account for basically the annual sediment budget, does that imply kind of a continuous delivery and reworking, or sort of
which system are you asking about? Is this
Irrawaddy?
Okay, so the cyclic profile that I showed, that was from our early Amazon work.
Right. That's what I'm saying, is whether you saw something like that in Irrawaddy.
No, we do. I mean, and I've been trying to think about that, because it was so striking on the Amazon when we saw those huge shifts in activity. And, from Dave DeMaster's early work, I mean, he kind of described it as you move further offshore, you're seeing, the influence of ocean scavenging and higher activities as you have longer residence time in ocean waters. And then the pulses of sediment that are coming out are essentially connected to the river, which and then through the fluid mud distribution process. And so those activities are low, and you have these stacking of high and low activities, which is completely evident on the Amazon. We don't see that on the Erawadi, and we don't see as strong a gradient either. And so I don't know that, I'm not sure how much that reflects the sediment input process. It may well, but another possibility I was thinking about is, because of the huge freshwater input on the Amazon, and the estuarine circulation that's developed on the shelf, you may be pulling in a lot more open ocean water and accentuating that signal. We see some evidence maybe of non-steady state profiles on the Irrawaddy, but nothing like we saw on the Amazon. So I think the jury is still out on that.
Okay, great. So we have one more question from Adalik. Adalik from Malaysia. Okay.
Good evening. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, this may be a bit out of the topic, but I was just wondering, do you see any signal of tsunami impacts on the deposition process in the sediment layers, even in your chirp data? Since it was said the tsunami have a frequency of 200 to 500 years occurrence in this region.
In which region?
Within this area. I mean that what we have in 2004, the Aceh tsunami.
For the Irrawaddy?
Yes.
Okay. I mean, we certainly see, we see lots of structure in the chirp profiles. And, I'm thinking back now to the longer casting cores that we took. I mean, there are occasional sand layers that you can identify, but so I guess it's possible, but we haven't really made that correlation, I guess.
Okay, thanks.
Sure. Thanks.
Yeah.
Thanks for the question.
Yeah.
Okay. If no any other question, so I would like to mention that this coming Friday we have another talk about the global Delta data set. So that's as you can see, Rebecca and her advisor analyzed across the globe, worldwide, so many delta, those kind of environmental variables could help us to understand the future delta formation. So please, coming back this Friday, the same time, and also next week, of course, is talk about particularly next Friday, talk about the second stratigraphy. So thank you, Steve, very much. Thank you, everybody. Chuck also here. Steve, Chuck,
hey, Chuck.
silently listen to what you're talking about.
We'll have more to say later, no doubt.
Okay, Steve Goodbrand. Okay.
Hey, buddy.
Hey, thanks, Steve. Great to see you, man. It's great talk.
Forward your talk, man.
You do.
Yeah.
Okay,